Welcome to Perspectives on Prevention, the podcast series from the Prevention and Early Intervention Network, where we talk with people about intervening early and preventing difficulties arising for children, families, and communities. Welcome to Perspectives on Prevention, and in today's podcast I'm joined by Darren Bracken, who is the Trust and Safety Manager with Meta and also a local lad from Tala. So Darren, you're very welcome. It's great to chat.
Thanks for having me. Thanks a million. Yeah, great to be here.
So Darren, maybe just the first thing to talk about is you've an unusual background. So you work in Meta and you've a background in technology, but you also have a kind of community development ethos. So tell us a little bit about those two things and where they come from, and also then how you bring them together.
Yeah. So as you said, I'm a local lad. So I'm from Killinarden. I grew up over there, youngest of 12. So big family. And my mum was really involved in the community with the Killinarden Community Centre. So at a young age would have got involved there as they were running like a junior leader program, and would have been involved there very early on, helping out with summer projects and stuff like that from a very early age. And inspired by some of the youth workers there, and kind of thought, maybe this is the career that I want to go into. And so after school, I went to the Liberties College and I studied community studies there. And I said, maybe this is the career for me. But of course, it was around the time of the recession in Ireland, and obviously a lot of cuts to funding and stuff like that. Quite a difficult time for me. I was only about 18. My mum had passed away and stuff as well. And so I struggled a little bit, found myself a little bit lost. Where am I going? What am I doing? And I'm not sure if many people listening will remember, but there was a program called Jobs Bridge, where if you were like getting the social welfare, you could get €50 extra a week if you joined a company and you'd basically done an internship. So I found this company, Sage. They do accountancy and payroll software. And I started to do that with them for a couple of months. And I wasn't long, in fairness to them. And they were like, we really like what you're doing here. Would you like to come on in a part-time contract? So I was just answering phones and helping people out with their payroll. Got to learn lots about tax and stuff like that. So it was really interesting. And all the while, keeping things going with the community centre, volunteering and drop-ins, and would have done a lot of work with the youth workers over there around different programs, while also just figuring out my own life. And then stayed with them for a while and decided, I need to kind of get a little bit more educated here, and because I could see a career in it for myself. So done business management in IG Tala part-time. Got a role in Sage as a manager. So I was quite young. I was probably only about 21, and I started managing people, and I put a lot of that back down to KCCYP, to Killinarden, where, just those people skills, just being able to talk to people and understanding what makes teams tick. I think I got a lot of that from there, and it kind of came naturally to me. And then I started the career where I got more into the tech side. So I ended up at Stripe. Stripe it's an Irish company owned by two brothers here in Ireland. And I was quite early in there. We were building things up from the ground. And they're I think 90 billion valuation now, like massive company, thousands of employees. At the time there was a couple of hundred of us, and I worked in kind of operations there. So it wasn't long there, maybe 2 years, 3 years, and Meta reached out to me and said, look, we have this role. Actually, quite interestingly, it was focused on counterterrorism, where they said, hey, we're looking for someone to lead an operations, where we're trying to, at the time, there was a lot of conflict going on around the Middle East and places like that. And people using the platforms like Meta, Facebook at the time, to spread misinformation, propaganda, and to recruit people to actually travel and fight. And so we were kind of saying, how do we break this down from an operations perspective and figure out what are the signals for when someone is doing that? And we'd work with different law enforcement agencies, Interpol, FBI, you name it, and we would pass information over them. They would build cases and kind of chase some of these culprits down, and we'd remove them from the platform. And then TikTok took off. So when I went to TikTok, I done a bit of everything. So that was very specialized on kind of counterterrorism, but I actually broadened out and went more into child exploitation, and things like that. And I kind of drifted a little bit away from the U project over in Killinarden at that point. I would say just busy life, started my own family, that kind of thing. Um, but got chatting to Trish Kane, who's the youth worker over there, and there's just a couple of things where she was kind of saying, one, like, we're looking for male role models, generally speaking, here to speak to young people and to show them that there's a possibility for these types of careers. And then I started to realize actually a lot of what I'm doing, like, it's online, but it plays out offline. And the harms I'm trying to prevent online are actually, when I get into these communities and I talk to people, it actually makes me better at my job, and it allows me to educate people on what's going on in that online universe and why it's happening, how it's happening. So would have done a lot of focus groups, particularly around like substance abuse over in Killinarden, where like just sitting down with young people and saying, look, we know that people are using these platforms to sell drugs, for example, or even just people spreading misinformation around drugs, like, this is what happens, this is how great of a high it is, this is how amazing you'll feel, that kind of thing. And like, one, an educational piece for them where I'm saying this is how we find it, this is where the resources are for you. But also educational for me, where they were saying, well, these are the kind of slang words that we use. This is how it plays out. And that allowed us to build some AI algorithms to say, okay, we actually need to include this terminology. This is the type of behavior. Here's how we find it. So really, really interesting on that side. And then I was there for, obviously, at TikTok for a while, and decided I needed a little bit of a break. So took a year out recently, and now back again to Meta about 6 months ago. So currently focused a couple of what we would call like high harm prevention. So all of the really bad stuff that you see on the internet is what I'm focused on right now. But to come back to, I really feel, and I've touched on it, but I really feel like what I learned in like as a youth growing up in an area like Killinarden, going to a school like Killinarden Community School, um, it really teaches you, I think, a lot of fantastic, like, interpersonal skills, and being able to communicate with people taught me a lot of empathy. I felt very fortunate to get the support of the community centre. They would have sent me on sail training, like they'd done a cross-border thing where it was, eight Protestants from up north, eight Catholics from down south, and we sailed around Ireland and over to Scotland and things like that. And you learn a lot about reconciliation, even though you don't realise it at the time. And you learn a lot about conflict resolution, how to be with people you don't know, etc. I really feel like I carried that all the way. And so where I'm at now in my life is like, I've learned a lot from them. And then I went and learned a lot in tech. How can I marry the two and give a little bit back on that side as
Mm.
well?
Wow. I mean, one of the joys of doing this podcast is getting to hear these amazing stories about people's sort of journey. I mean, that's incredible. It's so interesting. Um, okay, so Darren, there are lots of ways that tech use is really positive. But obviously, particularly for parents of young children, or older young people, I suppose, we do, there are concerns. So, um, so I'm thinking about, like, for parents or for people working with young children, like, what are the things to watch for, to prevent grooming or to prevent children and young people getting kind of caught into conversations that are inappropriate? Or, I mean, what would your advice be in relation to that?
Yeah. Um, it's an extremely difficult thing to tackle generally, right? Because, what we refer to these people as bad actors, and bad actors are constantly trying to circumvent platforms, mechanisms for detecting them, right? And so there's only so much that a platform can do in terms of technology and building things out. So what I believe where the answers to this lies is within our communities, within education. I mean, as CDI, you guys talk about early intervention. And I think, it's an online thing, but like, obviously these platforms are online things, but you can take these things that we implement in our day-to-day lives offline and implement them there. And so what I'm getting at here is, I really feel conversations, education of young people is like paramount here, because a young person being able to identify whether they're in a dangerous situation or not is a learned skill. And some children might be better at than others, but to me there's not enough out there in terms of education. I actually believe that these platforms need to do more, not just in protecting people while they're in these online spaces, but educating them offline as well. I
Mm.
think there can be more engagement with communities to say, we're running this type of program. Let's get together as a group. Let's educate. There's an educational pathway for a young person, and there's an educational pathway for a parent, and for communities too, community workers, I mean, and trusted individuals. So I think there's a lot can be done around that. These platforms do have parental tools, I would say. Like, so for example, on Instagram, a parent can link their Instagram account to their child's account. That's a great feature in theory. And I often talk about, I don't know many, say, 16-year-olds that want to pair their Instagram account to their parents' account. So again, it comes back to being able to have these conversations. One, parents knowing the signs to look out for, and they look similar to signs we would look out for general well-being, in terms of, is a young person pulling back? Are they more reserved? Are you seeing a little bit more secrecy around the way in which they're engaging with their phones, with social media, etc.? A couple of things that we see is, they will misuse certain features. So on Instagram, for example, you have a thing called close friends. And for a parent, I found this with my own daughter. I would look at her Instagram account, and it looks like she's no posts at all. So her Instagram page looks empty, but she's a couple of hundred followers. I know she uses it all the time. So I'm going, well, where's all the posts? And then, having a chat with her saying, do you have posts on Instagram? And she said, oh yeah, I do, but I hide them all. I only show the people I want to see them. So that's a great feature in some ways, right? That protects her in some ways. She doesn't have all these strangers looking at her posts, but it also shelters her from my eyes. I don't have oversight as to, is she posting appropriate or inappropriate content? Luckily in my case, it wasn't that, but these are things you need to be aware of. So for example, if you're logging in, you see that your young person has an empty account, just a conversation. And I think starting those conversations is really, really important. And in a way that isn't, what are you doing? When are you doing it? What's going on? But, oh, I don't really understand that. Explain it to me. And you'll find that's very engaging for a young person, because they know it inside out and they want to talk about it.
Yeah.
They might not want to talk about the specifics of their social media, but they will want to talk to you about it generally, because it's something they're knowledgeable about.
And Darren, so that thing about the education online and offline, what do you think about the kind of public move to ban mobile phones? So, this whole thing about, like, not letting children have a mobile phone until they're a certain age. I mean, what's your view on that?
Yeah, this answer will sound a little bit hypocritical, but I would be very much in favor of keeping the likes of social media apps and things like that out of reach until you, as a parent, think that your child is mature enough to be able to engage with it. I think it's a very fleeting thing to say, anyone under the age of 16 shouldn't have a mobile phone. There's many reasons why they should. And, we talked about at the beginning that, like, there's a lot of positives even to social media. So I really think it should be up to the individual, the family circumstances, etc. Now that creates another situation around peer pressure and, well, John has one, so I want one. And I understand that. But generally speaking, I would be in favor of reducing risk and exposure to, and not just social media, but I find my kids. So for example, I have an 8-year-old, and if you get her on a day where she hasn't had her iPad in front of her, and like she plays this game Toca Boca. So for any parents out there, they probably know it. It's very safe. There's no engagement with anyone else on it, but they just play with little characters. And it's quite engaging. But at the same time, if I get her where she hasn't been on it for an hour or two, she's a different child, and she's much more engaged. She's more willing to talk to me about her day and what's going on in school and things like that. So generally speaking, these screens are just constantly releasing dopamine for us as adults and for them as children, and their brains aren't as developed as us. So they don't necessarily have a full understanding of what that dopamine hit is, and they're left chasing it and not understanding why. And that can show up in ways like moodiness, irritability, etc. So I do think it's a good idea, but I also think, you might decide that my 16-year-old isn't mature enough for a mobile phone or for social media. I might decide, well, my 13-year-old actually is, and she needs it. And so my stance on it is it good to have this conversation? Absolutely. But I do think it's better for you as a parent or a guardian to have control over it and make a judgment for your family, as opposed to a blanket, 15, 16 is the cut off. That sounds a little bit hypocritical as someone who works in tech.
Mm.
And I know that a lot of people might feel like some of these social media platforms just, they don't care the age, they just want people to engage. And it might come across like that way, in fairness. But for me, as someone who works in trust and safety, and my role as someone in trust and safety is to keep people safe. Um, I would be of the opinion that the less risk and the less exposure at an early age, the better.
Okay, great. The other thing that I suppose we all worry about, and experience on any social media is misinformation, and um and sort of being able to distinguish between, truth and fiction, and also then, the algorithms kind of, consistently, throwing stuff at us, with sort of consistent, potentially negative messaging. And I was kind of interested when you talked about Killinarden wanting positive male role models. So, obviously there are the influencers out there that are kind of feeding a very negative view of masculinity and stuff. So just I mean, what are your thoughts about that, and how we can all be better at critical thinking, I
Yeah.
suppose?
Yeah. It, it's a fascinating topic, and I think in years to come, there will be, a thesis written on this, and look backs, and at this particular moment in time, it's so interesting what's happening and how it's playing out. And I've kind of extensive experience around mis and disinformation in the work that I do. And so um I have a couple of thoughts here. One is, like, in terms of the why, because I think the why is important. And to me, misinformation shows up where there's a gap, where there's a void, and it tends to try kind of fill a void. And I often think about it in the context of, think about a newspaper that you don't like. Right? Think about, whether it be, I don't want to name specific newspapers, but there's certain newspapers that I look at and go, that's a rag and I don't want to read it, right? And you say, if you think about the why are they like that? Because it sells. That's why. That's why they want to tell all the stories about celebrity gossip, or they want to sensationalize, the puns around a terrible murder case. They'll throw something like that up. And
Mm.
the why is because it does engage. Our brains are somewhat hardwired to engage with that type of information, right? Um, and you know, someone who loves reading celebrity gossip, whether it's true or not, that's relatively harmless. The problem is when you're getting into topics that are harmful. And for me, that it's the same on social media, right? It's this kind of, and I think the Oxford Dictionary this year, the word of the year is rage bait.
I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, right? And the reason for that is, and you see it even in harmless, like I see a lot of like personal trainer content where they'll put something out that is completely against the conventional wisdom, and they know it's incorrect, but they also know people will engage in the comments. It will elevate their profile. More and more of the content will be seen in the news feed. And again, that's relatively harmless, I would say. But if you think about it in the context of something like immigration, politics, etc., it becomes more harmful. So that's the why. In terms of what's happening, is it's being amplified. And I do think, again, I work in social media, and I want to be somewhat careful about this, but the reality of it is that in terms of currency, engagement and people's time is currency in social media. The more active users they have, the more people they have interacting with content, the more they can sell ads. They can that's the business model, right? The business model is engage platforms equals more advertising hours, more advertising time, etc. So that's all kind of wrapping up the why. The how of it is really interesting, and I break this out. Like, I don't think oftentimes people understand the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is the me going, "Oh my God, I heard this terrible story. Did you hear about this thing?" And it might not be true, and that spreads. Disinformation is almost the more seedy side of that, where someone is saying, for whatever reason, whether it's monetary, whether it's wanting to push a certain agenda, but they're purposely spreading misinformation, and they want to sow division, etc. So there's a difference between the two, and both are as equally hard to tackle. And I don't want to come across as passing the book here, but I would come back again to, like, how we approach these things offline is almost more important to what platforms do online. platforms can do more, need to do more, and should do more. But us as communities, we can have such a big impact on some of this. So the problem, I'll talk about some of the problems for social media and tackling it. The scale of the problem is really hard. So we can demote certain content. So what we do is we figure out, okay, this piece of content comes up. It usually takes a while before it gains a bit of traction, and then it might find its way to a content reviewer or a content moderator. And they'll look at it, they might send it to a fact checker who will say, yes, that's true. No, that's not true. And then we will demote the content. Now, that sounds like a big process. That will happen really quickly. Where most time is lost is it actually reaching us in the first place.
And sorry, what does demote mean?
So demote will mean that we won't show it up in a newsfeed. So we won't push it into the algorithm so that it will spread quickly. We will instead say, okay, one, let's downrank it so it doesn't show up in the feed as prevalently, so not everybody will see it. We'll do things like limit the amount of comments that are on it, or hide some of the comments if we detect a certain tone. So, for example, I'm using it because it's topical, but if we talk about immigration, a lot of times around immigration misinformation, you'll see some like dehumanizing content comments in underneath that content. Once we spot that, then we'll say that's usually a signal to say that, we don't want to amplify this. So we will reduce the visibility of some of those comments, and we will downrank the video itself so that it doesn't constantly show up in people's feeds. We can take more.
Would you spot that?
A couple of things. So, like, for example, if, like I said, the example of dehumanizing content, we would have a list of keywords that we know, and in different languages, etc., that we know are dehumanizing when they're used in a certain tone, and we use essentially an algorithm, AI algorithm, to detect this. We'll send it to a content moderator, and they will say, yeah, that is dehumanizing content, and so we'll downrank it in that way. User reports is another way. So people will go in to look at a piece of content, hit report, and violates our community policies, etc. And so that's another way that we will find it. Engaging with NGOs and different groups on the ground as well sometimes. So a lot of platforms will have almost like a backdoor reporting system where you can reach out to these platforms and say, hey, look, this content we don't want, this isn't good, we don't want to see it up there, and we can downrank it there. And we'll get some reports from government agencies as well, and law enforcement agencies too, to say, like, this content shouldn't be on the platform. But where it gets really tricky is, sometimes it's hard to know, is this thing true or not? And if you think about it in the context of like our community here in Tallaght, for example, like someone like you might be able to look at a piece of content and say, that's absolutely trope. It's not true. But if you take a platform like Meta, TikTok, you name it, and you look at their processes, oftentimes their content reviews are based in, Morocco or different countries, and they don't have that cultural nuance and context, and it can be hard to build. And sometimes people will say, when I talk with that, sometimes people say, well, build it out here, build it out in Ireland, and then you'll have it. But like, you think about, over 1 billion pieces of content being posted on platforms a day. To do that in every single country or every single community, it's extremely expensive and difficult. Things like AI are making it a little bit easier. But again, coming back to my point, I think we need to engage in these like offline and online worlds together. And so what I was going to come back to here around the community pieces, like misinformation, to me, like I said, it's filling a void, it's filling a gap. You talked about the toxic masculinity piece. When I was at TikTok, one of the things that we saw that was really challenging was the stuff around Andrew Tate. So a lot of, alpha male type things. And this is a good example of things going too far on both sides, right? So one, there is a gap for young males of people that they should look up to, and that gap we've seen time and time again getting filled by the wrong individuals. And what that often creates then is a little bit of an echo chamber where the people that are in it look for more role models like that, more Andrew Tates, more, you name the insert toxic male here, right? But my counterpoint to that is, well, the best way to tackle misinformation is with correct information, with stories, with bringing people together. And oftentimes I think platforms go after the Andrew Tates of this world, where, one of the things that we worked on at TikTok was actually how do we, so your TikTok feed is showing you more of what you want to see. You engage with Andrew Tate content, we'll send you more Andrew Tate content. And one of the things that we try to do is actually, if we see people engaging in this and our feed is full of it, how do we put some counter speech in there? Who are some positive male role models that we can, infiltrate the news feed and push more of that? Now, the problem with that is, who are we as a platform to decide who a positive male role model is? And so this comes back to, it's easier to do it in an offline world. It's easier to educate your community leaders, your parents, to say, this is the type of thing that you need to look out for. But also, young people, young males, they need to be engaged. They need to have an outlet. They need to be able to show masculinity in a non-toxic way. Because what happened for us, well, in my opinion, around that period of time around Andrew Tate, is it went too far, where any male kind of engaging in a bit of bravado was labeled toxic, and that's toxic masculinity showing. So you can go too far is what I'm getting at. We can do that as a community, and it happens very, very quickly. But again, for me, like I said, the way in which we tackle misinformation, it's not about like more information necessarily. It's not about more data. It's about stories. It's about empathy and understanding. Like I said, particularly topical again around immigration, because these ones we see spread so quickly. But for me, it's about, what actually is that person's story in the iPass, not what is the story of the iPass, because we kind of group it together as this big monster that we don't understand or know. And actually, if you break it down as at an individual level and you say, if I spoke to the angriest person up at City West a few weeks ago, the angriest person, if I spoke to them and said, what do you think about this? They would give me a generic, they shouldn't be here, they're taking our jobs, those kind of things that we see, right? But if I said, what do you think about this person, this individual who's here, and they fled this country, and this is their story, they're much more likely to be empathetic towards it, and they're much more likely to engage. And so I think the remedy to misinformation and disinformation is real stories, authentic stories, and it's having people in our communities that understand that and have trust built early on that can almost intercept the misinformation, if that makes sense. But unfortunately, when it comes to misinformation, oftentimes we're being very reactive. It's the nature of it. And it can be hard to predict what the next thing is that's gonna spread. But if you have those people in our communities that are trusted, that have built rapport with individuals, they're more likely to listen to them, and I think that's the answer to misinformation.
So one of the things that has come up as a result of these podcasts is the question about telling stories from lived experience has the risk of exploiting people. And so how do we do that? How do we harness the empathy that can come from sharing lived experience stories with, minding people and being respectful? And what are your thoughts on that?
Extremely difficult, because it is a double-edged sword, right? And no matter how much you and I might have this conversation and our hearts are in the right place with it, but you're always going to get some bad actors. And if working in trust and safety over the last decade has taught me anything, it's some people are bad for badness sake. And so you will always get that element of people trying to counter the positive, I would say. So it's a difficult thing. But what I would say is, it's it's not about coming together in a community hall and telling a story as a one-off. It's about all of us in our day-to-day lives challenging some of these tropes, for want of a better word. And I think the more that we do that, the more we will win over hearts and minds of other people, right? So I think we have to live it each day. And I know that sounds a little bit like cliche, but it's the conversations at dinner time. It's well, I saw this thing on the news and that's terrible. And I've had this myself, with family members where they will have a certain opinion on something. I will have a certain opinion on something. Something will come up and I will go, I'm not even engaging with that because I don't have the energy for it. And so what I would say is, find the energy. Find the energy, because it protects people around you when you're willing to have those conversations. So that's a start. But in terms of protecting people, like, I do think one of the ways to do this is to do it in a semi-anonymous way, and you can protect people's identities, etc. But I honestly believe that it's less impactful. And so that's the trade-off there. I think we do need to protect people's I guess protect their anonymity where they feel they want to, but also if someone is willing to tell their story, I think we have to create that safe space. I think you do like be mindful of the channels that we're sharing it on. Sometimes we think reach is more important, but it's like anything, quality over quantity, I would say. So it's not about here's this person's story and I'm going to share it far and wide and everybody needs to see it. Sometimes it's about here's this person's story and there's a certain group of people this would be really impactful to if we shared it, and they're the ones that you need to target as opposed to a blanket approach.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, Darren, I'm just interested in the work you've mentioned about the sort of positive role models and engaging with young men in Killinarden. What have you kind of gleaned from those engagements? What's going on for young men, and how can we support them in their journey?
Yeah. Um, it's changing rapidly, I would say, which is interesting to me. So, a few years ago, I would have spoke to a lot of people in the community centre. Like I said, I'm the youngest of 12. I've lots of nephews, nieces and nephews, and I would have talked to a lot of them. And there was a lot of people in our area who almost felt that growing up in an area like this is a ceiling in itself, and would limit their own opportunities and possibilities in their own minds. I'm seeing a big shift in that, which is really interesting. I was up in Killinarden Community School last week and I spoke to students. We done like basically like speed dating for careers, and they would go around and chat to each of us, and nearly every boy, more so every male over female, had an idea of what they wanted to do and where they wanted to go. And some of it was, I want to be an apprentice. Some of it was I want to be an engineer, I want to be a doctor. And I think at that age to be able to, even if they don't go there, even if that changes for them, to be able to have an anchor to say this is where I want to go, that's really, really powerful. But in terms of the challenges, I think I'm not sure which organization it was actually, but I saw a video there maybe last year around young boys in particular hanging out around say shops and stuff like that. And there's this misconception around, their thugs and things like that. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there's not trouble or antisocial behavior that kicks off, but if we can imagine if we were in their shoes and everywhere we went because we're wearing a tracksuit or we're hanging out in a certain area, we're labeled as a thug, that can be very one, demotivating, but two, limiting. You will, if you're told for long enough this is who you are and this is what you are, you'll eventually start to believe it. So I think that is a big challenge. And what I would say is, you know, let's challenge our own misconceptions around who the young men in our lives are and what they are. And think about them as a family member, because very oftentimes we wouldn't think of our own family member, even if they were in those situations, we wouldn't think about them as being antisocial or whatever. And so I would say we need to challenge that. But what I would also say is one of the things that's really fantastic in the area is there is a lot of services for young people to engage in now, and more young boys are engaging in those services. But the final challenge, I would say, one thing that isn't going away and is more rampant, I would say, is just opportunities to engage with substance abuse. At a very young age, I'm seeing a lot of that in the area. And I've spoken to a lot of young people that are telling me, some that are like, I don't do it, but it's everywhere. And some that are like, yeah, look, I've engaged with it. For whatever reason, it might start out as, or at least from their perspectives, it might start out as recreational. But oftentimes, whether it's in this area or any area, when we engage with substances like that, we're running from something, and they mightn't have the capacity to understand what they're running from or if they're running right now. I sorry, because I said that was the final thing, but actually I done so I'm not sure if you're familiar with Park Run, but I done Park Run yesterday, and it was in Mountjoy Prison. So they engage with prisoners, they get them running. They're in the progression unit in Mountjoy Prison. And we all go in, we run with them, we do a run, and afterwards they do like a little concert, and they bring us around the prison and they give us a tour. And I got talking to a couple of the lads there, and like the other thing that I would say is like we're not, and don't get me wrong, some of these people have done, some pretty serious crimes. But the capacity to change our outcomes, to grow, to self-develop, it's in everyone. And these young people in our area, they're not yet on that path of find themselves in somewhere like Mountjoy or whatever. And so having, as we said, more male role models in their lives, more services for them to engage in, particularly people who are more vulnerable in terms of falling into substance abuse, etc. Get them into these services, and engage in them early on, and having people who look and sound like them is really, really important. And I'm by no means an expert in any of this, but like what I do find is when I speak to young people, particularly in Killinarden, like I said, I was up at the school last week, and when I say to students, "Oh, I'm a previous student here," like, "No way, you can't believe that," and so they really respond well to people who have shared experiences.
Mm.
And so I would say the more we can do that, and if there's anybody kind of listening who thinks, I mightn't be the best speaker in the world, or I'm in this career, I'm in it for age. It doesn't matter what you do, who you are. If you're someone who is living a positive life, you can give something back to young people in the area. And we spoke a lot about males. I mean, across the board, there's a lot of females out there that need role models as well. And it doesn't matter whether you can be a male role model to a female young person too. So I just encourage people that whether you realize it or not, we can all be role models to people, and it doesn't take much. It can be an hour a month of your time to drop into the local community centre, engage with your local school or whatever it might be. And it's, apart from that else, it's actually just really rewarding. Over the last kind of couple of weeks, I've had a lot of these types of engagements. So sometimes they do that. They don't come for a long time, and then they all come at once. And I find they're extremely uplifting. So it's been really, really cool.
Great. Well, Darren, thank you so much for the time. It's been really good to chat with you. And it's brilliant to know there are people like you that are creating that bridge between the online and offline world. So thanks for chatting on Perspectives from Prevention.
Thanks, Amelia. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives on Prevention. We hope we've inspired you and given you something to think about. If you want to suggest someone for us to chat with, we'd love to hear from you. Just drop us an email at info@pein.ie.